Welcome to another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host for the program. With me today is one of our regular commentators, Denise Keel. Denise is a professor in the Political Science Department at Western, and she's affiliated with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Did I get it right this time?
Did it. Oh, perfect.
Okay. And Denise also serves as the chair of our working group on climate change at WMU. And with us today also we have a special guest, Christian Parenti, who's a professor of economics at John Jay College in New York City. So Christian, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Christian's here to present a lecture tonight at Western Michigan University, and we were fortunate to be able to have him sit down with us and talk a little bit about some of the issues that he's been writing on in recent years. One of the important books, I think the reason that you're here is that Alan Webb, professor at Western, read Tropic of Chaos and just was blown away by that book and really became much more interested in looking at that whole concept of the politics of the armed lifeboat and such. And so it was Alan who really pushed to make sure that you come here and talk about this issue. I read the book when it first came out and was very impressed also. And
Thank you.
So I think it was just a wonderful bit of reporting that you've done. So tell us a little bit about your background, because do you have a PhD in sociology, is that right? Or
I have a PhD in sociology and geography
Okay.
from the London School of Economics, and I've always been a journalist and an academic, but for a number of years after I got my PhD and did some postdoctoral, 3 years of postdoctoral work at the CUNY Graduate Center with David Harvey and Neil Smith, who are geographers. And sort of as part of that, I with their blessings, which is very unusual for academics, I kind of ramped up the journalistic side of my career. So for almost a decade, I was pretty much out of academia and working on reporting, foreign reporting, and involved in some documentary films. And then I have more recently gone back into academia for the last probably 7 or so years now. And Tropic of Chaos kind of came out of that period of conflict reporting. Yeah, so that's basically
and you
my background in a nutshell.
were writing for The Nation, among other publications during that time as well.
Yep.
So I think that's maybe how I first came across your work, was through The Nation.
Well,
Yep.
probably through your other, maybe even more famous book, Lockdown, on the prison system, right? So there's a theme, prison surveillance, conflict is sort of an overriding theme in your work.
Yeah, I've written 4 books: Lockdown America, Police and Prisons in the Age of Crisis, and the next one was The Soft Cage,
Right.
Surveillance in America from Slavery to the War on Terror, which looked at sort of everyday surveillance rather than police investigations, like where do IDs come from, where does data, what's the prehistory of data mining. And then a book of reporting from Iraq called The Freedom, Shadows and Hallucinations in Occupied Iraq, and this book, Tropic of Chaos. And so a theme throughout my work has been violence and also state power. And I've been very critical of state power, but I also have a very, I think, a profound understanding of just how central the state is and violence is to modern society, and that the government has a very important role in the development of capitalism that is overlooked by both the left and the right. It's attacked, that fundamental fact that government is central to the production of capitalism is attacked and denied by the libertarian right, and it's largely ignored by the left, which much of the left, I shouldn't overgeneralize, but much of the left has absorbed a kind of, an anti-statist mentality. And so my current project is looking at the deep origins of American developmentalism, the way in which the U.S. government has, from the founding of the Republic, been set up to nurture manufacturing and guide the economy, and how one of the main problems that we face is that we're in denial of this. And it's not that these interventionist strategies of subsidy, tax breaks, tariff protection, government purchasing, it's not that these kinds of tools of policy that Alexander Hamilton called the means proper for the government to guide the development of the economy, it's not that these are not used. They are used. We just don't acknowledge their use, and so we don't have real conversations about what we could and should be doing with this sector of our economy, which is, the public sector is more than a third of the economy. So now it might seem strange, but yes, my work is, the central theme through it is the state and coercion. And now I'm increasingly interested in how the state inevitably coerces capital, and how, if we're to deal with climate change, the state has to be pressured by people and social movements, citizens, to coerce capital to get off of fossil fuels and build out a renewable energy sector. And I'm actually optimistic. I'm not optimistic, I shouldn't say that, but I am totally convinced that all of the pieces that we need to make an energy transition are in place. The technology, the laws, and there's plenty of money, but whether or not there's the political will. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Well, just to jump in, what's so interesting, I think, about your work, and we have a book club that read your book, so hopefully there'll be some knowledgeable students there this evening, is the historical approach that you take. So it's this role of the state and violence and coercion, but the historical approach, and what is past is prelude, and this argument of going back, Alexander Hamilton, the federal bank, right? Those original arguments in our Constitution, all the way today, I think I just read 35% of the federal government's 35% of the economy, no matter which way you look at it. That's right. That's right, for the public sector, and that we've always relied on big government to make the kind of investments that really are needed today. I think that historical argument is what you contribute really fascinatingly in all of your work. So,
thank you.
One of the things that I really liked about Tropic of Chaos, coming at it from a sociological perspective, is that you really focused a lot on the social impacts of climate change. And sometimes I think those tend to get overlooked. We're focusing on, well, what is it now? We're up to 403 parts per million carbon dioxide. And some of the other effects, ecological or physical effects of climate change, but then sometimes the more social impacts get overlooked. And I loved your concept of the catastrophic convergence in that book. Can you just explain what you mean by the catastrophic convergence?
Sure. The idea is that climate change is driving violence. And the reason I wrote Tropic of Chaos was because, in part, I wanted to deal with the issue of failed states. And the right, from the 90s on, the right was focusing on state failure. And the punchline was always, well, we need more U.S. military intervention, which is actually, if you look at the history of most failed states, frequently one of the causes, a contributing factor is U.S. military intervention. Libya, for example, being the most recent example. And I wanted to offer a progressive or left kind of history of that and critique of the whole problem. So this then merges with the question of climate change, which is increasingly part of this problem. And so the catastrophic convergence is an acknowledgement that climate change doesn't cause violence in isolation. It always interacts with previously existing crises, and the main pre-existing crises in the global south are the legacy of Cold War militarism and now war on terror militarism that has littered the countryside of many developing countries with cheap weapons and men who know how to use them. And then the other crisis is a crisis of neoliberal economic restructuring, which has for 30 or more years been pushed on one economy after another by the powerful economies of the OECD, particularly the US leading the charge, and through the World Bank and the IMF. And this logic, neoliberalism, is that it's the logic of libertarianism, that the market can solve all problems, that government intervention in the market merely creates distortions and problems, and that if you want to have high rates of growth, high rates of employment, and not have a boom and bust cycle, have equilibrium, the government should be systematically removed from intervention in the economy. So that means that states are pressured to sell off public assets like airlines, public transportation systems, to cut subsidies to farmers, to cut subsidies to the public health care system, to the education system, to open their markets to imports and to open their capital markets to foreign investment without any regulation, so remove capital control so capital can come in and go out of the economy as it sees fit. And this, of course, in reality, introduces all sorts of volatility. So this set of policies has been pushed since the debt crisis of the early 1980s on one country after another in the name of efficiency and growth and full employment. But it delivers usually low rates of growth. Sometimes it does deliver high rates of growth. In India, for example, liberalization of the economy has been associated with increased growth rates, but it's focused on a few urban tech and finance hubs while the countryside languishes. But neoliberal policy restructuring, neoliberal restructuring doesn't always lead to high rates of growth. In Latin America, during the 1980s, that was in many ways the first laboratory of neoliberal restructuring. And macroeconomic performance in Latin America during the 80s was really anemic. Regardless of whether there's increased rates of growth or kind of flatline stagnant growth, there's always increased inequality.
Right.
And that creates anomie, normlessness, and relative deprivation. People experience their deprivation. Sociologists know this, right? People experience deprivation, poverty, suffering, not in absolute terms, but in relationship to what used to be, what somebody else has, what some prophet or organizer or mystic says should be. And so when you have rising inequality, you have an increase in relative deprivation. So, the social impact is that both Cold War militarism, which involves lots of counterinsurgency, which sociologically speaking is a form of warfare that attacks the social fabric in a way that conventional warfare doesn't. Because in conventional warfare, the object is to gain territory. And in counterinsurgency, generally, where government forces are fighting some sort of insurgency, the government controls the territory, but they don't control the population. So then they attack the social bonds of the population using informants and torture and trying to turn people, reconcentrating the population. Guatemala is probably one of the classic examples where 400 native Guatemalan villages were burnt to the ground, and over 100,000 people were killed in that conflict. And then people were reconcentrated in these development poles, as they were called, under the observation of the military, and family members were turned against each other in civil war. So that phrased the social fabric. So these are the pre-existing crises that affect much of the global South. And now, onto this stage, preset with these problems, comes the extreme weather of climate change, increased drought and flooding. And generally, the pattern is that overall precipitation rates or amounts or levels are going up, but the patterns of precipitation are changing, so the rains are coming all at once in sudden floods. So the overall experience, and then the land as a result doesn't absorb the water as well. So the overall experience, even though there's more precipitation, is generally of increased drought. And the other thing that neoliberalism does to the developing state in the global South is strips it of its capacities to do anything. So people in a place like Kenya or Guatemala or rural Mexico facing the extreme weather associated with climate change, fisher folk or farmers losing their crops, the fish not being there, they turn to the state for some assistance, and the state has nothing for them because it has been restructured fundamentally to get out of the way of the market, and the market likewise has nothing for them because if you're a penniless farmer, what's the market got for you? You need to have cash for the market to if you have lots of money, then oh yeah, we'll build you, someone will drill a well, or if you have lots of money, we could import some hybrid seeds that might help you or whatever. But if you don't, then you're on your own. So people have to adapt to this crisis, and they turn to what resources are at hand, and very often that means cheap weaponry. And so they turn on their neighbors. And frequently these civil wars that at first glance look to be religious or ethnic conflicts, and those are important components in them. But if you dig a little deeper, you see there's also an economic crisis, which is either caused by or interacting with an environmental crisis. So that's the catastrophic convergence. It's the legacy of militarism and the legacy of neoliberal restructuring combining together and combining with the onset of climate change. And armed adaptation is its main symptom. People in the global south trying to adapt. And migration is another huge part of that. And then there's a kind of climate violence that occurs in the global north in response to these waves of refugees. We see that happening in Europe on the Mediterranean now, where there's over 1 million people thus far have migrated to Europe, and the response has been Frontex, the EU's border security agency, has really beefed up policing in the Mediterranean. There are detention camps all over the southern Mediterranean. Country after country are militarizing their borders the way the US did in the early 90s. Just as a caveat, I mean, that's something that's been in several of my books. The border is already militarized.
Yes.
You have Bill Clinton to thank for that. I mean, Donald Trump talking about the wall, but there is a wall. It's made out of metal in most places. He wants to change it to cement. So then you see there's this kind of state hardening, unfortunately, and the xenophobic parties take advantage of this. You've got the far right making unprecedented gains in elections across Europe. We've got Alternative for Germany, which is a far right party, has 13%.
13%, yeah.
Of the seats in the German parliament. The Conservative Party in Austria. With a really kind of like far right agenda. They sort of took the old far right agenda, has just won. And across Europe, we're seeing this pattern.
Yeah. What's so instructive about what you're talking about, from my vantage point, again, I try to teach courses on political science and sustainable development, and some of this history that you're talking about is the addressing of the true causes. Right, what we often want to do, or what makes political gains, is to look at the situation today and make a very quick judgment. And there are a couple ways to react to what's going on, as you've sort of laid out, right? There's the armed lifeboat, the xenophobe, protect yourself, or there's this larger public investment, planning, recognizing the true causes of insecurity, inequality, militarization, and actually addressing those. I'm just so curious to ask you what you think of the processes that we've tried to deal with those things through the United Nations and the Conference on Environment and Development. Since the 70s, folks have been trying to do that, and they would, I think, agree with you. These are the sources of inequality, and these are the true sources of conflict, and what we need is better institutional capacity, right? Because otherwise, folks say, well, we give money to these failed states, and it's just corrupt, and they bribe each other, and then that's wasted money. I wonder if you think that there is any institutional hope out there in some of the international agreements, even all the way up. I know Ron has Paris Climate Accords in his, what's your take on those institutional structures?
I don't put much faith in them because, I think they're important, but the Kyoto Protocol was the first international agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions, and it had very little effect other than the serendipitous decrease in emissions in Russia because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the former Soviet republics saw the worst, greatest contraction of economies outside of wartime, and increase in poverty, and just a total collapse of consumption. And so as a result, their CO2 emissions went down by 5%. But that said, it is important to have those agreements to help nudge policymakers along. They are those confabs with all of their ridiculousness are educational sectors for these kinds of elites. I remember I talked to a top climate scientist from India, and I didn't quote this in the book, but I was asking him about Indian politicians and their views on climate change, which have changed since that interview. And he said they're in total denial about it, and it's like they don't read this science at all. And he says when they go to these meetings, that they get it, kind of like for several days, and so that has some effect on their thinking. But other than that, they're just sort of in denial about it. But then they've actually, been changing. So there's something to that, but I don't put a lot of stock in it. What I do think is more important, though. One thing that could be good is if there's agreements for technology and financial transfer.
Yeah, exactly. The financial stuff, which is, has been there all along and maybe is strongest in the Paris Accords if people actually do what they say they're
Yeah.
going to do. Yeah.
But even more important than that, I think, is the rate of technological transformation in large economies.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the U.S., we're now pulling back from an energy transition, but we did make significant progress. There has been a significant build out of renewable energy, and globally, if you look at it, 2/3 of all new energy capacity added last year was renewable energy.
Right.
China has been making huge strides in this regard, and it has a lot to do with local crises. The air quality in China is so bad that working class people and elites alike are pressuring the government to do something about these, the unbreathable air. And foreign firms can't get executives to move to places like Beijing because the air is so bad. So in response to the local crisis, China is trying to clean up its air, and that is having a significant effect in terms of building out renewable energy capacity. So the trickle-down effects of sort of large economies, that I think is more important, because as Africa increasingly electrifies, as rural India, where there are as many poor people or more poor people in rural India than there are in all of Africa. But as rural parts of the world that don't have regular electricity build out electrical capacity, the question is sort of what technology makes the most sense economically. So if the economies of scale are reached in places like China and the EU and the US, you can imagine how someone who owns a bar in the center of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where now actually the Chinese are rebuilding the roads and rebuilding electrical lines, but you can imagine how somebody there, opens a bar and they want refrigeration for the food and the beer, and the question is, do they buy a diesel generator for which they have to buy diesel, or is there some cost competitive solar array that will actually do the job that you can run your business off of because the guy down the street has the same thing? In that case, if once that technology, renewable energy technology, clean technology, can beat fossil fuel technology in the market, that's when developing economies are going to start switching. And so that is as important as any kind of set of laws or rules, or not laws, but agreements that states make and then frequently
And your argument would be that without public investment in that technology, not going to happen, or not going to happen fast enough, right?
Yep. Yep. And public investment in clean technology, and also removing the subsidies that go to fossil fuels. So right now, about 25% of all the oil, gas, and coal produced in the U.S. comes from public lands.
That's right.
So step one would just be like, go find your own fossil fuels. You can't have the publics. The publicly owned fossil fuels are off limits now. We'll get to, the property rights issues around denying private ownership, privately held such resources being developed. But so that's a huge subsidy. There's production tax credits are given to fossil fuels. All that stuff should be pulled, and they should be hit with essentially carbon taxes. And so all economists, left, right, and center, agree that a carbon tax would be the best policy to drive an energy transition. And we actually have the ability to impose a de facto carbon tax because the EPA is supposed to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act of 1970. And there was a lawsuit called Massachusetts versus EPA that said in 2007, yes, the EPA must do this. And we've been waiting for the EPA to actually issue all the tailoring rules pursuant to that and start setting limits for one industry after another. And under Obama, we saw limits for automobiles and for new coal-fired power plants were produced. But those were both politically easy to do because they were sort of redundant federal regulations. Car emissions were de facto regulated through fuel efficiency standards, and also California's emission standards, it being such a large market, are kind of de facto national market. So that was politically easy. And then also the fracking revolution means that there's so much cheap natural gas that no one's going to build the new coal-fired power plants. So that was also politically easy.
The war on coal comes from the market,
It
right?
comes from the market.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Well, which all those regulations have been rescinded anyways, the Clean Power Plan. But it is interesting, the prescriptive coal, right, knocking on the new power plants versus a carbon tax and doing something that triggers the market response. Because your argument really is the market is failing here, and the role of government, classically, traditionally, has been to step in a market failure and steer the course. Right.
And it's also always there. It's not just in the moments of
True.
emergency. It's
Good point.
constantly, you know.
Good point. We're
doing
always
this.
directing
Yeah.
the course through our public choices. Yeah. I'll let Ron talk now.
No. You wrote a piece, I think was originally on Tom Dispatch, maybe in The Nation, on why climate change will make you love big government. So now that has to do a lot with the kind of things that you're talking about here in terms of economic development, but just in terms of responding to when we just had 3 massive hurricanes strike parts of the United States. And you know, the mobilization of the military to respond was enormous in all those cases. Is that part of what you're talking about in addition to the economic part of it?
Yeah, that it, you know, in moments of crises, it becomes apparent that you know, volunteer efforts aren't sufficient, and that people turn to the state. They expect government to help them out. And you know, while the Cajun Navy is admirable, a lot of these volunteers also, you know, when these things go well, interact with government. You know, it's like government that coordinates it. And then particularly in the rebuilding, you know, it's like, who's going to pay for this? There's like, what, over 100,000 homes in Houston, 85% of which don't have flood insurance, have been wiped out. So we'll see what happens. But I suspect that all of the talk about how government is bad is going to quiet down, and there'll be a massive infusion of federal money into helping that build out. And if that doesn't happen, then there's going to be interesting political constituencies will develop as sea levels rise and storm surges increase, and more cities have their infrastructure hammered, and that is primarily a public responsibility, like the subway in New York, which flooded.
Right.
You know, this calls forth the question of, okay, who's going to pay for the reproduction of society? Business, capitalism needs society, right? It exists within society. If there's no public transportation, workers can't get to work. If there's no healthcare system, right, the whole thing falls apart. So we're actually now seeing this developing just a little bit in New York. There's a question of who's going to pay for repairs to the subway, and the subway is just absolutely overburdened. Like something like 1 million more people have started riding it in the last 10 years. There hasn't been proper investment. It was flooded, and there's constant breakdowns. And so Bill de Blasio, who's the mayor, who's not a particularly left mayor, I mean, he's done pretty much everything the developers have wanted, but he said it's merit to say, well, there should be a tax on the ultra-rich. Individuals who make over $500,000 a year, couples that make over $1 million a year, I think is what it was, something like that. And there's been tremendous pushback. So now the question is, who's going to pay for the subway that you know, all of business in New York depends on? Is it going to be the riders and the taxpayers, like the common taxpayers, or is it going to be the elite who have lots and lots of money? And that kind of fight over the cost of the reproduction of society could really be, could ramp up in the coming decades as this kind of coastal urban crisis caused by increased storm surges sets in. That people who don't currently sort of think of themselves in any kind of class terms will have, you know, because in their workplace they don't necessarily have a kind of class consciousness, might start developing a class consciousness in the realm of reproduction, the sphere of reproduction, the home, the neighborhood, the city, and the question of who's going to pay for the reproduction of society, the poor or the rich? And the rich, you know, the 1% are at like levels of wealth that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age, and just staggering amounts of wealth at the very, very, very top of the pyramid.
Right. I love your example from New York City. I think when Bloomberg was still mayor, though, and big snowstorm comes, and they had cut funding from a lot of the city services. And I think a great quote that I use from that article from you is, even the rich were still surrounded by piles of snow, and their trash had built up for a couple weeks with no sanitation workers. So, yeah, to me, this is the classic collective action problem. And in Tropic of Chaos, you do lay out again these two scenarios of maybe this could lead to increased cooperation, which is what we would be the optimist to hope for, that these constituencies develop, and we should be cooperating together to reach these public goals. Or it's the politics of the armed lifeboat. And in Tropic of Chaos, you say the armed lifeboat is winning at that moment in time, 2011. What do you see today? I know you always write historically, so I wonder what you would. How would you update Tropic of Chaos with, and how would you answer that question today?
I'm not sure I'd be more optimistic today. But to be perfectly honest, I haven't been to Houston and looked into that. I mean, I know that there is, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, has groups of young people down there mucking out, helping people muck out their homes, and they're kind of in there doing the work and, politicizing the situation, which is to say, pointing out the reality and the truth of the situation. So, I don't know. Maybe there might be stuff developing below the radar that I don't know about. But I mean, generally, the larger kind of political picture with Donald Trump is just that xenophobia and fear and hatred have surged, and that again, that has to do a lot with this ultra-rich set. Like the Koch brothers, the Mercers, Richard Mellon Scaife, these far-right libertarians who have vast amounts of money, who have been central to the right-wing think tank movement since the early 50s.
Absolutely.
And they are, they have a disproportionate amount of power now in American politics. It's come out that the Mercers have been central in funding Breitbart. Breitbart has been that's where Bannon came from and where he went back to. And that's really like the kind of journalistic alma mater of a lot of the new right people. Richard Spencer came through there, a whole bunch of other characters. And so that's very much, even though the alt-right types don't talk about climate change, that's very much the politics of the armed lifeboat, being anti-immigrant, being in favor of a kind of increased militarization of everyday life.
Right. Yeah, which this book was written in 2011. A lot of people, when we read this book, a couple of weeks ago, had to look back and say 2011 because the chapter on America,
American walls and demagogues.
It was so fresh and seems so current as to what's happening right now for so many in an unfortunate way. But
so let's talk a little bit more about Trump. How does the presidency of Donald Trump play into the things that you've been analyzing? Is it going to simply be an accelerant, amplify some of those trends? Is it how do you see the Trump presidency ultimately affecting these trends that you've been diagnosing? Because to some extent, Trump seems to be a bit of a wild card on top of just the other ways we normally think about him, but kind of a wild card in terms of some of these other economic trends that are developing.
Yeah, he is a wild card. You're right. I mean, he beat a whole crew of essentially, libertarian foundation-funded candidates. And he is his own man, and he's a bit of a lunatic, obviously, unpredictable. So it's hard to say. It is really, I think at one level, it seems like Trump is creating so much chaos that, he was the chaos candidate, as I think Rubio put it, right? He's creating so much chaos that the far-right agenda of the GOP, which has really been taken over and refurbished by these billionaire libertarians, that there are many good books writing about this whole scene, the donors' trust and all this stuff. So he hasn't undone Obamacare. We'll see if the tax reform can get through. So there's a weird way in which he seems to be stalling the restructuring, the right-wing neoliberal restructuring of the U.S. economy But on the other hand, his rhetoric is really ramping up racism and xenophobia and militarism, and his lack of interest and knowledge about the world is highly dangerous. And as he is pressured by Mueller's investigation and what I think are fantasies that Democrats think that there's going to be some sort of impeachment of him, I don't see that happening. He could become increasingly aggressive on the international sphere, and there could be mistakes. I mean, that's how great wars happen. It's like by mistake, right? The South knew that the North was going to fold when they seceded from the Union, except that didn't happen. The French and Germans during the beginning of World War I both thought the war was going to be like 3 weeks long. It was no problem. So huge calamities frequently happen through miscalculation, and that's pretty dangerous. And in terms on the climate front, it's really bad. It's just really, really bad. What he's doing is to the EPA is terrible.
Well, he rolled back the exact thing that you're calling for, which I absolutely agree with. Let's stop oil and gas production on public lands. Number one, that was at least an executive order under Obama. It's been rescinded. That's public lands are open again. I mean, it's just a
They
real
were open for
dismantling.
most of the 8 years under Obama, but
They were, not to the end. I know, it's true. But at least, there was some movement towards those kinds of things that's now just absolutely stopped. The Trump question is interesting to me given the economic solutions that you're focusing on, because my other view of Trump is he's a transactional guy. And if anything, the business model and the movement of business and technology into making money in the renewable energy sector is waking up, to me, a lot of economists, as you mentioned earlier, the Mayor Bloombergs, the businesses. Folks are recognizing that the market is already going that way, and this could be an opportunity to fix all of these problems, this convergence that you talk about. It surprises me that the transactional nature of Trump maybe doesn't jump into that part of it. Maybe infrastructure is the one area where everybody agrees.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing for understanding that is that he's really a media property, right? He plays a developer on television.
That's true.
But he develops. He's a developer. Breaks out of Queens and Brooklyn into Manhattan. He then overdevelops casinos in Atlantic City. He has a crisis in the 1980s. There are, I forget how many banks, like 40 banks that that he owes money to, and they have, after his Atlantic City collapse in like around, I think it's 1990 or 91, they have a come to Jesus meeting with Trump, and it was really unclear at that moment whether they were going to toss him over and just like liquidate this garbage, which was his Atlantic City holdings. He kind of like literally built casinos like essentially across the street from himself, was competing with himself. And it was Wilbur Ross, now our trade secretary, who was one of these bankers who organized them and said, no, what we have to do is we have to basically put this guy on a stipend and relaunch the brand. And so Trump was put on a $500,000 a month stipend and sent out there to pump up the brand so that the bankers could hold this and eventually offload it when it recovered a little bit. And he developed Trump Soho, which was a highly illegal breaking through the kind of height limits in Soho. It's like a hotel. It's not a, I mean, it portrays itself as a hotel, but it's actually an apartment building and full of, flight capital, elites from around the world who've stolen money from the public sector, buying a lot of Manhattan real estate and London real estate are essentially that. It's legal in this country to own 2 LLCs, and for an individual to have one limited liability company buy a piece of property and then sell it to another limited liability company that you also own, and thus launder money anyway. But so, most of what Trump has been doing is branding, going around lending the Trump brand to developments. They don't actually deal with developing these things. Like when Eric Trump talked about, oh, we're doing this project in Kuwait or where it was like, no, they're looking for partners to brand with. They're going to lend the brand. They're not dealing with who's going to give you the cement. How do you manage the labor of these radical South Asian Indian workers from Kerala, a lot of them, who are going to be pressuring on your construction sites? What do you do about the government, when you want to import this or that technology? They don't deal with that kind of like nuts and bolts stuff anymore. So that I think is part of the problem. He exists in a business. he increasingly comes out of a business that's just about perceptions. He's a media personality who plays a developer, and so he's that much further removed from reality. I mean, I wish that he was really actually a developer who was all about concrete and
Right.
like how you cut deals with unions and stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So where do you see the Mueller investigation going, and what effect do you think it might have on the political situation?
I don't know. I do know that it requires that, getting rid of the president requires impeachment, and with the House and Senate controlled by Republicans, I just don't see that happening. Even if the agenda is stalled, I think that the idea of impeaching your own leader, it damages the party brand, and then they won't do it for that reason.
Yeah.
Also, the 2018 elections don't look good, I think, for the Democrats because of voter suppression and gerrymandering. There's been some good court cases that have ruled against gerrymandering. I haven't followed that too closely, but I know that there's been some positive movement in that regard. But as Ari Berman, my colleague at The Nation, has written about, voter suppression is just rampant these days in the U.S. And there's been several books that have mentioned. One book that's completely devoted to the gerrymandering of the following 2010. And in several states, the Republicans, so what happened was, the Republican operatives encouraged Republican donors to donate locally at state levels rather than nationally to help with this project of redistricting. Because according to the Constitution, right, every 10 years there's got to be a census and then redistricting. And in some of these states, like North Carolina, the proportion of votes for Republicans went down and their proportion of seats went up. So the idea that the Democrats are going to sweep 2018, I think, is delusional.
Without some voter reform, some redistricting reform. Absolutely. Wisconsin is another perfect case. That's the case that's before the court right now. So,
and there was a ruling on the Wisconsin case where they said your voter ID law or your voter
is in violation.
And so then the state went and said to the however many counties it is, like hundreds of counties, said, okay, you guys come up with the rules. So now there's like countless rules, and the Justice Department is in no mood to investigate. But so we'll see. So I mean, so I don't see Trump getting impeached, but that's.
And you were sort of suggesting that perhaps Trump staying in office stalls the agenda better than anything else the Democrats could come up with at this point, right?
But it also doesn't move forward the public investment that you're talking about.
Right.
That's the bigger problem.
Right.
Maybe state and local and businesses are doing that on their own. That's something that I try to look at, but I absolutely agree with you. That's great. It's not going to be enough.
Yeah, and they're not moving a policy agenda through legislation, but they're doing really devastating things within the agencies in terms of removing regulation, changing the rules, and that's highly destructive.
That's right.
President Pence would do that as well, but he might be able to pass legislation.
So what about the Pentagon? Clearly, the Pentagon has, for quite a long time, talked about climate change and said this is real, poses a national security threat. We need to be thinking about it, planning, developing some sort of strategy. How do you see the Pentagon's role in all of this? And is that simply, even though the Pentagon is maybe one institution that's recognizing the reality of climate change at the same time, how the Pentagon would respond sounds so it would go more in the direction of the politics of the armed lifeboat in the end.
Yeah, I mean, the Pentagon, to its credit, takes climate science seriously. It relies on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an international body designed to vet all of the latest climate science and digest it and present it in forms that are usable to policymakers. The Pentagon uses that science in its planning in the Quadrennial Defense Review, but the Pentagon, the military, is designed to, as they say, break things and kill people. It's not a policy, it's not a civilian policy apparatus. The one way in which that's not true is around innovation and experimentation. So in our denial of having a mixed economy and the centrality of government, we don't have industrial planning. That's not something that can be discussed, but we have the military-industrial complex instead, and there's lots of government subsidized innovation that happens under the cloak of military planning. So Mariana Mazzucato, in her book, The Entrepreneurial State, uses the example of the iPhone, which has 12 different types of publicly produced, publicly subsidized technologies that are then later.
Siri is the big example.
Siri, GPS, the smart glass, all sorts of stuff. I mean, the entire computer sector is really dependent, historically speaking, on government. So, and the Pentagon is experimenting with renewable energy, in part because the expense of moving fuel in these two wars or occupations, Iraq and Afghanistan, has been so extreme. And there was a report about Afghanistan alone, and it determined the number of U.S. soldiers killed moving fuel, and it was about 150, just shy of 150 had been killed, and many hundred others wounded, often very badly, just to move fuel, and it's extremely expensive. So they're experimenting with solar power and stuff like that, and that's the one kind of positive economic effect that the military's concern with the environment can have. But mostly their job is to do military things. I mean, it's useful. I always say to my students and to audiences, if you're arguing with your conservative relatives who love the Pentagon but don't believe in climate change, remind them that the Pentagon does, in fact.
I've tried that one, and then I was told that was Obama's Pentagon, so it was the culture of doubt pervades us, but I'm with you.
But we need broader involvement of the public sector in other realms. The Pentagon's not going to save us.
Yeah.
And so your argument is that the public sector has to be pressured in a variety of ways to do more, and a lot of that's connected with investments in new technologies. I mean, you talked about this weathering technology in one of the articles that I read, and just the more general development of renewables. So what's the best case scenario about how we move forward, how the public sector gets involved in a way that might help us deal with climate disruption?
There's, government procurement is very important. So if you look historically at how technologies have come to market, frequently government procurement plays an important role, not just government subsidy of R&D, but like in aeronautics, the government bought up all the patents and made them publicly available, and then it subsidized the nascent airline industry by paying them to fly the males until they kind of got on their feet and then they could fly passengers around. During war, unfortunately, that's the hothouse of government-led developments. During war, the rules of the market are suspended, and government starts setting production targets. It starts subsidizing credit, and it becomes a dirigiste command economy, and you get great leaps forward in technology. And so government purchasing of this technology is key to all of that, right? It's not just the subsidy of the R&D, but it's being the first consumer. IBM, for the first 2 decades of its existence, sold more than half of its products to the federal government, and still government is a huge consumer of IT. So government could and should commit to consuming clean energy. The United States actually has rules around purchasing that are more strict than in China or France, which are two heavily statist economies. And national origin rules are tighter in the U.S. So if you're a government bureaucrat and buying paper, you don't just buy the cheapest paper. There's some consideration about American jobs and American firms being dealt in. So government should be committing to buying clean energy for its buildings. The federal government has 450,000 buildings. They're mostly very inefficient. They should all be retrofitted. If that many buildings were retrofitted, it would help build a market for retrofitting. It would prove, for one thing, that you can do this and save money, and then you'd see the private sector also retrofitting their buildings. Those buildings should then be consuming renewable energy. Public fleets, the post office, all government fleets should be switching to electric cars, building out charging stations. If that happened, then the price of electric vehicles would drop to the point where it would make pure economic sense for a lot of local businesses to just switch over to electric trucks. So those are the kinds of things that it should be doing. Consuming clean tech, removing subsidies for dirty technology, increasing subsidies and supports for clean technology. And if that happens and there are economies of scale reached and clean technologies like solar, distributed solar, commercial scale, wind and solar, electric vehicles, if the prices fall low enough, then the rest of the world, which is not developing technologies, smaller economies that receive technologies from larger economies, will adopt those technologies. So I think that's the most important thing to be done, and states can still do that. You know, California is a huge economy. I'm not sure what the latest is, but there's a consortium of 8 states that have been trying to move forward on electrifying their vehicle fleets. So those kinds of things can still happen at the state level. And I think that actually we should also be thinking about all institutions in that regard. That you know, the great problem with Al Gore's movie of whenever that was, 2007, was he ends with consumption, like go out and you change your light bulbs. But that, I think any politics that appeals to personal consumption is kind of a dead end, partly because, as my friend and colleague Jason Moore says, you know, consumption is work for a lot of people. You know, they don't necessarily enjoy their commute or enjoy going out and buying stuff. It's like one more form of work they have to do. So why give them grief about it, you know? But in terms of institutions, their consumption patterns really do matter. And you know, university students should, in my opinion, be pressuring their universities to break their contracts with utility companies in markets where you can choose your power source and switch to 100% clean energy. I mean, like in New York, you can do that. And so those kinds of, in terms of focusing on institutional level consumption, that can also help drive the transition. And ultimately, you know, getting off of fossil fuels, mitigating the problem, getting off of fossil fuels and building out a clean energy sector doesn't constitute an end to the environmental crisis. That doesn't mean we have a sustainable society. But it does mean that we're dealing with the most pressing problem first and buying time. Because the problem with climate change is that it threatens to be a non-linear problem, that the causes build up and the effects lag behind. And so when the effects kick in, they can kick in rather suddenly all at once. So sea levels are rising, but the rate of increase is also increasing. They're rising faster and faster. So as we start feeling the symptoms, it's going to be harder and harder to deal in an appropriate time frame. So, you know, we have to, you know, kind of deal with this crisis as much as we can to stave off this kind of runaway, sudden climate change. And if we can do that and stabilize the problem, then we can carry on with trying to deal with the many other problems like overfishing, increased toxicity of the environment. I mean, it's pretty clear that neonicotinoid pesticides are probably what's responsible for this, just in the last 5 years, like precipitous decline in insect populations.
Exactly.
Yeah, microplastics everywhere. I mean, there's so many other environmental problems that have to be dealt with. But climate change is, in many ways, like it's like a triage. We have to do triage by dealing with climate change to buy another century of time to deal with these other problems.
I know we're getting close to time here, but I do want to ask you to maybe just a little bit more on, you know, power is never given away, it's always taken. And I couldn't agree with you more on the institutional changes. What kind of pressure points, when you talk a little bit about students demanding universities, citizens, what's the most effective form of pressure on our institutions in your mind?
Well, I think, you know, people, the old-fashioned way, people organizing and pressuring, being disruptive and wrenching concessions from those in power by being disruptive. I think organized labor really has to rebuild, and that's a difficult problem. How's that to happen? I mean, organized labor has become very dependent on the Democratic Party, and it's easy to criticize that from the left, because if you look at the national level, it seems quite irrational. Why is organized labor taking members' money and basically just giving it to the Democratic Party or buying television ads for them with it? This is ridiculous. And they don't spend as much on organizing in many cases. But then you look at the local level and you say, okay, well, at the local level, Democratic Party in cities and counties and states, the Democratic Party really does do something for organized labor that it doesn't do at the national level. And so the problem for organized labor is that you can't really have it both ways. You can't be like, oh, we're tight with the Democratic Party at this county, but never mind when they come knocking for Hillary Clinton, we're, you know, that'll cause huge problems. But that dependence on the Democratic Party belies a deeper problem, which is like an inability to kind of engage with ideas, to engage in the battle of ideas, change the discourse of the country, to really organize in an old-fashioned way. And a lot of money is spent in the name of doing these things, but not much seems to be done with it. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that there aren't good radical ideas in organized labor. So that's something that has to be dealt with. And I mean, I don't know how social movements are to be reborn. I have participated in social movements, but I'm not a theorist of social movements. I do take heart in the ideas of Francis Fox Piven, who points out that movements happen in sort of generation-long cycles, and it does seem that we're in the process of some buildup. You know, sort of like from Seattle 1999 to the anti-war mobilizations of 2003, the Obama field canvass, then Occupy Wall Street, then the Bernie Sanders campaign. I mean, I'm from Vermont, and you know, my father was friends with Bernie Sanders, and I was like, what, who's going to vote for this guy? 70-year-old guy from Vermont, you know, like, who's a socialist? This is a nice idea, but it's not going to happen. But lo and behold, it did. So we do seem to be in the process of something big that is quite organic, and the revival of Democratic Socialists of America is very interesting. So who knows where it's all headed?
Yeah. Well, we just have about a minute left, and I want to thank you very much for being with us today. Tropic of Chaos is the 2011 book, and many of us have really found that to be a very engaging book and helpful book. And the book that you're working on is, what's
It's
tentative title?
The Means Proper, and it's looking at, it's with Verso, who did Lockdown America, and looking at the deep origins of American developmentalism, specifically starting with Alexander Hamilton's Report on Manufactures, which is a crucial document that is bizarrely never read, discussed, or taught in economics in this country, even though it's been quite influential in many developmentalist states in East Asia, for example.
Well, we'll definitely look
More
for that.
course material. Thank you for writing.
So thank you again for being with us.
Thank
and
you.
we thank you for joining us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.